Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here for VideoCopilot.net, and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking a look at creating this really cool crumbling effect inside of After Effects. So let's take a look. All right, so it's pretty interesting, and there's a lot going on. Now, it's a procedural effect, so you can see that the actual chunks of the wall are breaking off in the shape of the title or the graphic or whatever you want to put in there. And we have some dust and we have some micro bits flying around. And then we also have some, splash of dust and things coming that we use from the Action Essentials collection. But of course, we could probably build just a particle system of some, soft particles floating around. So you don't really need the Action Essentials, but we do it just to add a little bit more detail. Now, what's great about the technique is that it's almost completely procedural. So if I go inside to the title holder comp, I can maybe change the text here. And then if I go into the final comp, basically, my dreams will crumble away. I mean, the word dreams will crumble away. So we'll take a look. We can see that it's all updated with the new title. So it's kind of a quick, easy way to change stuff. And frankly, it's kind of like a metaphor for life. We chase our dreams and they just end up crumbling away, and then we spend the next 20 years, picking up all the pieces. Get it? Because of the pieces. Anyway, I spent the last 20 minutes thinking of that joke and didn't go over very well. So let's just move on. It's great, but it doesn't have to be titles. It could be it could be logos, and it'll all just work right in with this process. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll learn some cool stuff. All right, let's go and get started. First thing we're going to do is create a new composition. We'll make it half HD, 960 by 540, 24 frames per second. We'll do maybe 100 frames long. We'll hit OK. Now, the first thing I want to do is create our background. So we'll take this dirty concrete and we'll scale it down a bit. Now, we're going to be doing a lot of things procedurally, so we're going to need to pre-comp things as we go. So here we have our background layer, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose that, and we'll call this BG and hit OK. Now the next step is to create our title. So we'll zoom in, we'll take the text tool, we'll type in here crumble, and we'll just scale that up. And we'll just kind of center it here a little bit. Now we can work on the look as we go. So we'll take this title, we'll choose layer, pre-compose, and we're going to call this title holder and hit OK. Now I'm going to also double click on that title holder, and in here we want to add some cracks. So we have this cracks.png, and we just drop it on there. It's basically just some gray, cracks from an image. And one more thing, we're going to create a new adjustment layer, and this is going to allow us to colorize this. So we'll just choose Effect, Generate, Fill, and we're just going to fill it with gray, like a middle gray, and we'll play with this, make it darker and lighter, just depending on the look. So that's good. We'll go back into Comp 1, and let's play around with the look of the final effect. All right, so the first thing I'm thinking is the background is a little washed out. So let's double click on that comp, and we'll do a little bit of color correction. So we'll choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves, and we'll just, darken it a little bit, maybe add a little red into the mix, and bring the blue channel down a little bit. So it's kind of warm, looks pretty good. Back into the main comp. Now I have our title holder here, and I'm going to set the transfer mode to multiply. That makes it a little bit darker. But first, I want to add the inner bevel to make this look a little bit more 3D. So we'll take our title holder and we'll choose Layer, Layer Styles, and we're going to add an inner shadow. So that's pretty cool. It just kind of gives it a little bit of darkness, and we'll go down to the settings here, set this to 90 so it's coming straight above, and maybe turn the size down a little bit so it's not as soft, and the distance up just a little bit. So maybe we'll set that to 4, and we're also going to add a bevel emboss. So we'll choose layer, layer style, bevel and emboss, and again, let's play around with the settings. So we'll set it to an outer bevel. Now we want it to seem like the light is coming from above, so we'll set the direction to down, and that's getting us a little bit closer. Might set the size down. Pretty good. All right, so that looks pretty good, and we can come back to those settings a little bit later. All right, so let's go and set up our crumbling effect using the Shatter plugin. Now keep in mind, we want the pieces to look like they're coming off of the wall. So we want our shatter map texture to be the same as our background. So what we're going to do is take our background here and duplicate the layer. And then we'll take the copy and we're going to choose Layer, Pre-Compose. And we'll call this Shatter. And then I'll hit OK. And we'll double click on the Shatter comp. And inside, we just have the background. Now, I'm going to go ahead, in our comps over here, we have the title holder comp, which is basically our original outline of our logo or our graphic. And I'm going to bring that inside of this comp. Now, keep in mind, we only want our title to crumble away. So what I'm going to do is take the background layer and set the track matte to the alpha matte of our crumble layer. So what it does is creates an outline of our logo in the texture of our background. So then I'm going to take both of these layers and choose Layer, Pre-Compose, and we'll call this Textured Map. And then I'll hit OK. All right, so we'll go ahead and add the Shatter effect. So I'll choose Effects and Presets, and we'll type Shatter. And we'll take it and we'll drop it onto our textured map. And so here we have a simulation of this explosion, and we have a cool view option. We'll just set this to rendered. And so we just have some bricks. Now, if I turn on the transparency, you can see that we can see through these bricks, which makes it easy to composite into our scene later. Now, I want to change a few of the settings. So we'll go into the shape here, and I want to set it to glass. And this just makes some randomly shaped pieces, which are kind of good for what we're working on. So we'll set the repetitions up to maybe 50. And this just makes more in smaller pieces. So just a little bit more ideal for what we're doing. Now, if I scrub through, you can see that it's exploding out and the gravity is pulling it down. And that's because there is a force on and it has a strength of 5. So let's set the strength down to 0. So now what's happening is the pieces are just being affected by the gravity and they're just slowly falling. Now that's interesting, but what if I were to turn the depth down to say 0.05 and the radius to 0.2? Let's see what happens. Okay, so now the force radius is so small that it's not affecting the C and the E. So if I were to say make the radius even smaller, 0.1, you can see that it only affects these middle pieces. So let's set it to maybe 0.2 and then take the force position and click over here to the side. So my force starts way off screen here. Now I'm going to animate the position of the force. So we'll click on the stopwatch there and we'll go forward to the end of the animation, or maybe to frame 80. And we'll just move this over to the side. Now look what's happening. The pieces are slowly falling down. And the reason why is because the force is slowly animating across the title. So this is actually perfectly what we want to have happen. Now, a few things we want to change. So first of all, the strength is set to 0. So maybe we'll set that to 0.1. That way it just gives it a little bit more of an explosive feel as it falls off. The other thing we can do is come down to the physics and play it with a few of the settings. So maybe we'll set the rotation speed up to 1, maybe the randomness up to 1. And so we can maybe start getting the pieces to fly around a little bit more interestingly. Because right now they just kind of fall. So maybe we need to turn the strength amount up as well. 0.5, and that spaces them out a little bit more. All right, so that's not too bad. I think we can work with this. So we want to get this set and get the animation the way we want in this first shatter comp, because we're going to be reusing it in a couple of interesting ways. Another thing we want to pay attention to is up at the top here, we have the choice to render everything or just render the pieces. So if we render just the pieces, it'll make it a little bit easier to composite a little bit later on. All right, this is looking pretty good. We'll take a quick look. Okay, very nice. You know, it just occurred to me that we do a lot of destruction at Video Copilot, explosions and shooting, and you know, I always wondered if there was something wrong with me, you know, like why am I so prone to all this violence and mayhem? So I started seeing this therapist, and we started dating, and everything was good until my wife found out, and then it turned into this huge problem, and frankly, we didn't get anywhere, and I'm actually more conflicted. So until I figure out what's wrong with me, I guess we'll just have to keep on destroying stuff. So let's jump back over into our final comp, and this is where everything is going to come together. Maybe we'll put them on top really quick. Also, if we hit Control K, let's set the comp setting to just final comp so that we can keep this organized. Now, we have the shatter pieces on top, and maybe we shut that off. We can actually see the pieces start off looking exactly like the wall, and then they fall to their death. And if we turn the title back on, we can kind of see how this is going to work. Now, the question is, how can we get it so that as the pieces are created, they fall out, revealing the empty cutout that we created a little bit earlier? Now, that is the trick. So, how we're going to solve that problem, it's pretty simple, but it's also something you want to make sure that you keep track of. So, if we come over here to our shatter comp, we have everything we need right here. So, what I'm going to do is take this shatter comp and choose Edit, Duplicate. And we're going to call it Shatter Activate. Now, the reason we're going to call it that is because inside the shatter effect, we have a force. And the force is animating from left to right, and it's activating the pieces, and then they're slowly falling. But what if we did something like this? What if we went into the Shatter Activate comp, and it's exactly like the previous comp, but we're going to go into the Effects Control, go into the Force, and set the Strength down to 0. So now the pieces don't blow up. But we're also going to go into the Physics. We're going to set the gravity down to 0. We're going to set the rotation down to 0, the randomness, and all this other stuff, just to make sure nothing is happening to our pieces. So if we look closely, the only thing that's happening is the pieces are drawing on. Now, how can we use this as a map in combination with our title to reveal the background? Well, if we come back into our final comp, let's see how that should make sense. So we have our title holder here. So let's pre-compose that. So we'll choose Layer, Pre-compose, and we're going to leave all the attributes here. So we want to leave all the bevel and the inner shadow stuff in this comp. And we're going to call this Title Reveal. And then we'll hit OK. So now if we double click on that, we just have the title holder again. And then I can take the Shatter Activate comp, drop it inside, and then set the title holder, hit F4, track matte to alpha matte. So now it should write on just with that shatter map. So if I go back into the final comp, it should perfectly sync together, because as those pieces are drawn on, they also turn into real geometry as they fall to the ground. And what happens is it leaves us a nice little cutout. So this is a very cool, very easy way to create this effect. All right, so we have the basic idea. Our wall crumbles and we reveal some text, but let's go and work on the look. Now, first thing I want to do is make this shatter actually have a little bit of a shadow as it comes off of the wall. So we'll duplicate the layer, Control D, And we'll take the underneath layer and we'll call it Shatter Shadow. And we'll choose Effect, Generate, Fill, and we'll make it black. And we'll choose Effect, Blur, Radial Blur. And we'll set this to Fading Zoom. And we're going to set the position to a very high point. So if we grab that little point or just take the center here and click, we want to just move it up really high. And if we turn the amount up, maybe to about 5, it starts creating a little bit of a shadow. So this just might work. Now it's a little abrupt, but once we get the motion blur and everything on there, it should look pretty nice. You know, I just thought of something that I didn't really even do in the example that will actually make this look a lot better. Remember, our light source is coming from above. So if we go into the shatter effect, we can actually control a little bit of that. So let's go down to the lighting and let's set this to first comp light and let's create a new light. We'll just do a point light, 100% maybe. And let's move it up above everything where this light source is supposedly coming from. And we'll come back in here. Now we'll turn the light intensity up. So hit T, we'll just crank it up. And let's see how that looks in the final comp. So it's a little bit bright. Remember, we want the pieces to look like they're coming right off the wall. So let's bring that light down a little bit. And we can even push it, you know, back a little bit. See how that looks. That's pretty good. The idea is that the light is coming from above, but we might want to modify that a little bit. So let's turn that down. And let's turn up the ambient light. Maybe about there. So that looks pretty similar as the pieces come off. And then we have the light source coming from above, shadow coming down. Also for the shadow, I like to duplicate it and make a second one that's a little longer. And then we'll lower the opacity of the first one. So you can see that the amount here is 5 and the one below is 20. So if we lower the opacity and tweak this a little bit, maybe set that to 3 instead of 5, we can get a pretty decent looking shadow. Now, the other thing that we can tweak in the shatter effect is the thickness or the depth, what do they call it? The extrusion depth of the pieces. So maybe we'll set that to 5.15. See how that looks. You know, I could work with that. Let's go ahead and take a quick look and see what this looks like animated, just so you guys can feel like you're up to speed. All right. Okay, so looks pretty cool. All right, so we want this to look even more complex and have a bunch of micro particles. And you can see them a little bit in this example, the little lighter colored particles. They fly around just a little bit more randomly. And we want to create that. So to do it, we just take the original shatter comp and we're going to duplicate it. And we'll call it shatter micro. And we'll double click that. Now we're going to change this up a bit. So we'll shut the light off. We'll go into the effect control. We'll just set it to point source or distant source. And we're going to make some dramatic changes. So we'll change the repetitions up to like 100. And you know, we'll come back to that. First thing we need to do is we need to limit the amount of this image that we're actually processing, because if we add this many particles to the system already, it'll look repetitive and it'll look like the text is actually shattering, you know, twice. So what we need to do is create a smaller version of this or an outline. So let's go ahead and choose matte simple choker, and believe me, this took some time to figure out. And so what I've done is I've used the simple choker to choke out the outer edge. So we'll set that to about 3. maybe 4. And then I'm going to choose Effect, Channel, Invert. And I'm going to invert the alpha. So now I'm subtracting that original alpha. And then we'll choose Effect, Channel, Set, Matte. And I'm adding back the original alpha. So then if we take the stretch matte off, basically I'm creating a procedural outline. And the reason we go through these steps is that way, if you go into the title holder and you change this, it will update appropriately because all of these effects are procedural. They're not based on specific areas of the image. So definitely works out to the advantage. Then we take the shatter effect, put it after that, and now we're only shattering the pieces from the original result there. And this is good. So let's again turn these up to maybe 150. I mean, these should be quite small. And the strength, let's crank this up a little bit. So these pieces should fly around a little bit more dramatically. So let's go back to our final comp and drop in the microparticles. Now we could add a shadow to these, but I probably won't. I'm actually going to even use a curves adjustment to brighten them up. And, you know, might even make them a little bit smaller. Or you know what, let's try a different type. Maybe instead of glass, I don't know, crescents. I mean, they're so small, you shouldn't really be able to tell what they are. Now we might set the extrusion down to maybe 0.05 and maybe the strength down to 1.75. So that's pretty good. They just look like random little bits. So back to the final comp. Take a quick look. Okay, so that looks pretty good, and it just adds that extra bit of detail that should really sell this effect. Now, the next few things we want to add, maybe a vignette, maybe a new black solid here. Add ellipse here. Set it to subtract, hit F, and we'll feather it out. Oops, subtract. And maybe classic color burn, and then we'll lower the opacity a bit. So just make it a little more dramatic. Excellent. Now we're going to be using some elements from our Action Essentials 2 collection, specifically the 720p version, which is our high definition collection of action stock footage, explosions and blood and fire and smoke. And we're going to be using some of the dust elements, which are really helpful. So check that out. Now, if you don't have it, you can use Particle World. Check out the disintegration tutorial, and we create some different smoky type of particle systems that you could probably use in place of it. But for now, we're going to come over here, take the dust falling element, and we'll just bring it out. Now, in order to make this a little quicker, we're going to shut off all of the particles falling except for the main shatter falling pieces. So here we go. This particular element actually has 4 elements built into it. So we did, the shoot, and instead of just wasting a whole clip, we put the 4 variations on a single clip. So if we take it, we can just grab a rectangle mask and just draw a shape right down the middle for each one. So then I can duplicate this, double click on the mask, and then slide it over. And so now I have 2 of the elements in a separate layer. That'll be good. Now we can make a few copies of this or whatever, but what I'm going to do is maybe I'll take the rectangle tool and feather off the top here. So we'll hit subtract, turn up the feather amount. Same thing for the other one here. Grab the top, subtract, hit F, and feather it out. And the reason why is we want this element, let's see, kind of hard with just a little bit of space here, but we'll take one of the elements and we want it to start falling just as the crumbling happens. So we could lower the opacity down here, and then we have this one element beginning to crumble. And then we can take the next one and we'll just cascade it. So we'll slide it over and it'll start crumbling as the next one opens up, and maybe we'll lower the opacity also. And then just randomize the clip. So we'll duplicate one, maybe randomize the scale and where it emits from. And again, we'll offset the time of it so that they seem to just crumble out. So then we'll duplicate them all, Control D, and I'm just going to slide these over. There we go. And maybe one more here for the end, the S. Make sure that that has some dust. And then, you know, it's kind of cool that after it's done that maybe one or two of the letters still kind of sheds the dust. But for this, we'll just hit T. Let's see. If we select all of the layers, hold down Shift, hit T, we can set a keyframe for the opacity for all of them. And then move forward a bit, and we'll set the opacity to 0. So we're essentially just fading it out. And, you know, that's kind of a cheap thing to do, but this is kind of a cheap tutorial, so I'll let you guys make it look amazing. I'll just make it look bad. Now, we also have this dust wave. And this is going to be cool for making it look like the dust is, you know, hitting the ground, and a pool of dust is, or a cloud of dust is emitting. So if we just take this, drop it in here, we have this first batch of stuff falls down and it's going to hit the ground maybe about there. So let's have this dust kick up about that moment. Let's color correct this. I'll just use the tint effect, and it's actually real dust, so you can just lower it. It looks like it matches pretty good. So as those pieces hit, this dust kind of kicks up a little bit, and we'll lower the opacity, and then we'll duplicate it. So then as the rest of it falls, let's slide this over here and set the timing so that as it hits the ground, more dust kind of gets kicked up. And maybe to just make it look more random, we'll flip it. All right, cool. Then we'll turn everything back on. Shadow really helps integrate these elements. Now I'm feeling like our shatter pieces maybe are a little too thick. So let's go in there and let's set this down to maybe 0.1. Yeah, I like that a lot better. Cool. Now the final step, and believe me, I left it for last because it is also the slowest step, is to add motion blur. Now the problem with the shatter effect is it doesn't have built-in motion blur, and even if it did, I'm sure it would be extremely slow. But we're going to be using an effect called CC Force Motion Blur, and it's just fairly slow. So what we need to do is bring it up, Force Motion Blur. We need to apply it to the shatter effect and the micro particles. So we'll take it, drop it on the shatter effect. Here, I'll solo it. So it looks pretty good. All right, so if we take a look, the motion blur really makes a big difference. Now, you might set the samples down to 6 because this is essentially render passes. So the higher it is, it'll look better, but it'll also be extremely slow. So we'll turn everything back on here. And we'll add the force motion blur also to the micro particles. And those are the little particles that are flying around. We want to make sure they have motion blur. Otherwise, they might look a little bit odd. And that looks so much better. Now, it's very, very slow. So something you're going to want to be turning off while you work, and maybe turn it on right before you render everything off. So let's see a frame with everything on. Now the microparticles are a little harder to see. So if I put my curves after it, it brings them up a bit, but I can also go into the alpha channel and crank it up. So those are my pieces, and you don't want to do it too much, but you did all that work, you might as well make it so people can see it. All right, so this is pretty much the effect, and please be thinking about the ideas. This could be used for so many different things. Like we could be revealing bricks behind here. It could be the scene from Terminator 2 where he shoves them into the wall and all of the plaster falls off and we see the stuff underneath it. It could be ice cracking and crumbling away. So there can be a lot of different ways to use this effect, and hopefully you guys will see the potential here. We could go into the title holder. We could add the roughen edges effect. And that just kind of gives it, an interesting look. We could play with that a little bit. Makes the edges a little bit crunchy. And then if we look at the final comp, we can see that that edge actually looks a little bit more organic, or maybe you don't think it does, but that's the idea. So you can play around with that. And just remember how easy it is to change the effect. We can go into the title holder, change it to a new graphic or a new logo, and you could really have some fun putting your company logo together or mixing logos together. I took a couple of my favorite logos here. And I just thought, Mortal Kombat and Coca-Cola should merge at some point their logos and become sort of like a super company. But, that's just me. And, I imagine the deal would be very complicated. I mean, it'd have to be a perfect deal, a flawless deal to really go through. And that's just tough to do these days. Anyways, I'm Andrew Kramer. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Please check out the website. We've got the forum, the blog, a lot of great things happening there, and some very cool things happening in the next few weeks. So keep your eyes out for that. I am Andrew Kramer, and we will see you next time.